I had the fortune of hosting or of being a moderator for a discussion for what's called the World Nutrition Summit that's being put on by the Nutrition Network. This guy, Ken Berry, he pops up everywhere. He's also talking at that conference in March. And it'll be a virtual conference run out of South Africa. It's got a slightly different agenda. We're really looking collaboratively of how, from a macro and a micro perspective, not macro and micronutrients, but a macro and a micro nutrition guidance perspective, from individuals to corporations to governments, how can we help the world to migrate toward a proper human diet, provision of food security, and creating food for health instead of food for calories that then comes inherently with illness. And as I hosted this, one of the guys that was on the panel was another guy that most people don't know about by the name of Professor Tim Noakes. And Tim Noakes is like the spearhead of this movement. He was a professor to me when I was in medical school. So I've known Tim since I was in my early 20s, and just an absolute tremendous leader, and most importantly, humble to the point that he has acknowledged his mistakes. And the first mistake that he made, and he particularly deals with athletes, is he denounced carbohydrate loading in 2012 and went more to the low carb, high fat movement and asked athletes to become fat adapted. And the theory was that by having a readily available source of ketones, you would improve your athletic performance. That was his theory, and that's been most of the people that are in the athletic world that are proponents of this do it for a performance improvement. So the remarkable thing and the beautiful thing about Tim Noakes, and this video will be on my YouTube channel in the next few days, but Tim came on, he said, you know, Robert, if you were my medical student 2 years ago, if I was now your physiology teacher from way back, 2 weeks ago, I had an epiphany, and I've completely changed my thinking for this data. And he said he's done some meta-analyses where he looked at people on athletes taking a high carbohydrate diet and athletes on a high fat diet. And there was no difference in performance. There was no difference in performance. So what's going on? And he said, you know, the brilliance of what he's done is, and the reason why he got claim to fame is, obviously, if you're an athlete, what's the most important organ? Your muscles. And Tim Noakes, I remember as a young man, he would run these marathons and take a needle and jab it into his thigh muscle and do biopsies of his muscles. And he looked at muscle glycogen, and muscle glycogen and creatine became the holy grail of exercise physiology, which was the provision of energy to the muscles. But as he looked at more modern data from Scandinavia in particular, he realized that the muscles never run out of energy. They never, ever run out of energy substrate. There's always more energy in abundance available for the muscles. So fatigue, failure, performance, especially in endurance performance, which is his thing, ultra marathons, that kind of thing, is not related to energy provision to the muscles. Whether they're using ketones, whether they're using glycogen, it's irrelevant. But what he noticed is that in these athletes, whether they were fat adapted or on glucose, at some point their blood sugars would be very level, and then they might see a slight rise, and they get an insulin trigger to that rise, and then their blood sugars crash. And when their blood sugars crash, that's when performance stops. Now, one would think that that's an energy substrate provision to the muscles, but that's not true. The muscles are still getting tons of glycogen, tons of sugar, and they're sucking that out of the bloodstream. But what he said is his whole theory has changed, in that the ultimate failure or the ultimate performance regulator of these very fit endurance athletes is not the muscles, it's the brain. And he said it's energy provision to the brain that governs the ability to be from an endurance perspective. And when the brain is not getting adequate energy, and he says this is now in international terms, the ideal athlete runs between 2 and 4 millimoles per liter of glucose. And he says once that dips below 2, as you start to see that blood sugar level going below 2, the athlete automatically slows down. The brain shuts them down. And what the brain is doing is protecting them from this rise and then drop in. It's trying to protect itself. And the way it has to protect that itself is to shut the muscles down. And he said the value of a ketogenic diet is not to improve performance by running faster or being able to lift heavier. It is about the capacity for that longer endurance despite a lower sugar, because the ketones are there for a much, much longer period of time. And even when you replenish sugar during an ultramarathon, it isn't adequate. It gives you an extra half hour when you're eating a lot of carbohydrates, but it doesn't give you that long-term endurance. But fat adapting is the way to go. And it really, the governing organ is the brain. He said it's the central governor reflex. When the brain doesn't get adequate sugar to function, it automatically shuts down your body's functions. And I think that's a huge shift that helps us to understand that fat adaptation is crucially important to endurance, but don't expect it to improve your performance. Expect it to improve your recovery, expect it to improve your endurance, but don't expect it to suddenly magically, because that's what they were looking for. They were looking to say, well, we must perform better on fat, and the data doesn't represent that. But it really comes down to the brain support. Now, you and I are mere mortals. We aren't those Olympic athletes. By the way, the guy that won the marathon in the previous Olympics was the one guy in the top 10 that didn't run on sugar. Okay. Personal bests are also being cracked in 5K races by these supreme performers running on a high fat diet. But you and I are not that athlete. But what you and I and all other human beings do is we focus and concentrate on certain things intensely at times. So even though in surgery, my hands are doing this, they're not moving very much. I'm not exercising, but this thing requires massive amounts of energy substrate. And in human beings, fatigue, mental fatigue, is a huge problem when you see a slight dip in blood sugar, and especially if you're insulin resistant, you're going to see that earlier. You may see the rise and then that paradoxical hypoglycemia, but when that happens, your brain shuts down. And he saw evidence in athletes, but the same evidence is there in everyday performance. And as physicians, in my old days, there are 268 hours in a week. I have intimate knowledge of every one of them, because the badge of honor for surgeons was how long could you stay awake in a week? And then they limited that to an 80-hour work week. Well, I used to call that Tuesday, but there were reasons why we did that. But this is another crucially important aspect. We get so many people coming in, I'm fatigued all the time, I'm flat all the time, and I don't understand it. And I strongly suspect that what we're seeing is these fluctuations in blood sugar. And as that dips down slightly, especially if you're living, let's say at 120, 130, and now you dip down to 80, well, that's still a normal blood sugar. But your brain is not getting the energy substrate it uses. And because your insulin's high, you're blocking ketones, so it has no secondary substrate. And you're seeing these fatigue crashes. And we've looked at adrenal hormones, we've looked at cortisol, we've looked at all those other hormones. I think it is much more fundamental that this is a sugar concentration problem and a change in sugar concentration in the bloodstream and an absence of another substrate called ketones. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting theory, and I wouldn't be surprised if it isn't correct. That's definitely something that needs some more research to kind of tease out the minutia of that.
I think the key thing for me is not necessarily what your absolute blood sugar is, but it's the fluctuation. And I think Eric Westman referred me to this, and I think you've used it in some of your talks as well, where the difference between a normal blood sugar and someone with a high blood sugar, like in type 2 diabetes, is if you look at normal blood sugar, if you extracted all my blood sugar from my bloodstream at a blood sugar of 80, I've got about 4 to 5 grams of sugar in there. That diabetic with a blood sugar of 160, 180 only has about 1 or maybe 1.5 grams extra. The difference is minute to create almost a doubling of blood sugar. So it's not a 1-to-1 ratio, or it's not a metric ratio. And I think that a large part of the general fatigue is induced by that people feel, that somnolence, that fatigue, and then also not being able to go to sleep, waking up early, is largely still governed by insulin and fluctuations in blood sugar, as opposed to being all these hormones. Because the concern, and we talked about supplementation earlier on, everybody's throwing more and more supplements at people for, oh, this boosts this hormone and this. It may not be a pure hormonal thing. It may be something as simple as fluctuating blood sugar.
It's quite possible. And I definitely think hormones do play a part, but I don't think we know enough to say with authority that the hormones play the predominant part. And that's why I think that gives plenty of room for a theory like you're talking about to have some merit. Yeah, definitely.
Because the other piece of evidence, I again with the blood work that I've talked about, I measure all of these hormones, and I'm not able to see a pattern. There is no consistent pattern in certain cohorts representing the same information, but there is consistency with insulin resistance. There is consistency in widely fluctuating blood sugar. If you look at sodium levels are always right at 140. 1 or 2 points up. If they differ by more than 5 points off that 140, you're in some serious trouble. Whereas blood sugars can vary over the course of an hour by 100 points. And together with that, it's not just the sugar, the water fluctuates, everything else, because it's very hygroscopic. Every aspect of your biology fluctuates widely with that sugar. And I think that this is advocacy for us. I think we've taken too far a segue into all these esoteric things that are going on with the human body because they're measurable, but I've not found a pattern. There is a clear pattern with blood sugar. And the beauty about leveling it off with a ketogenic diet, the ideal person is that type 1 diabetic who keeps their blood sugar very constant. They're off physiologic hyperglycemic, and I think you've done a talk on this. When is blood sugar physiologic and when is blood sugar pathologic? But I think more attention fundamentally should be paid to that. And I think that brings us straight back to the keto roots. I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, no, I think that you're right. I think that very often we don't give the credence to fluctuations in serum glucose that we should. And I think probably glucose fluctuations can mimic many of the syndromes that we've given other names. And because, everybody wants to have an eponymous condition of the human body. We'd love to have something named after us,
Yeah,
right? We'd
yeah,
love to come up with this new thing. Dave Feldman's got this lean mass hyperresponder thing. Damn it. Now he's going to be known forever as the lean mass hyperresponder guy. And I want something named after me too. And I think very often it's just human nature to want to discover something when you haven't really discovered anything. You're just feeling the trunk of the elephant instead of the leg or the ear, and you're trying to call it a different thing, but really it turns out it's probably just glucose metabolism, insulin metabolism, and glucose fluctuations.
sure. And I think, the changes in insulin do affect all other hormones. So there are changes in those hormones, but there's no consistency. I have not been able to find consistency. And the value about having the kind of clinical practice I do is that there are these hordes of patients with similar symptoms, but there's no consistency. And yet there is the one thing that's constant is their insulin resistance and their fluctuations in blood sugar. And a further part of that is when you stabilize that fatigue goes away. So how many people don't report to you early on in a ketogenic diet when they remove those massive incoming fluctuations from eating sugar and starch, in a very short period of time, they're feeling better. Their fatigue is lifting, their inflammation is going away. So, and that is still primarily regulated by sugar. And I think that's also part of my anti-medication things. The number of people that I see coming in on hormonal replacements, men and women, on all these bizarre, women on massive doses of testosterone, men taking estrogen. Why are we doing this? Because we're addressing their fatigue, we're addressing their lack of energy from a hormonal perspective and not looking really fundamentally at their blood sugars.
Yeah, it could very well be that therapies like hormone optimization are quite often misused or overused by clinicians who forget about the kind of the bedrock foundation of metabolic health, which is glucose and insulin and glucagon metabolism. All the other hormones are kind of subservient to what insulin is doing, what glucagon's doing. And I think you're spot on in saying that the brain and its function and the brain's ability to control other bodily functions intimately tied to glucose metabolism. And anybody listening, make no mistake, Dr. Cywes and I are not intimating that you need to eat glucose to have glucose to feed your brain. Your body's
Quite the
perfectly
opposite.
capable of doing
Quite
that.
the
Yeah.
opposite. Yeah.
That's exactly right. But the brain, at least certain cells in the brain, absolutely have to have a very tightly controlled band of glucose level in order to function optimally. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if the brain, if it's not receiving that level of glucose, if it starts to shut down other bodily functions.
Well, and
And that
that's
would
what
just be a
Tim,
self-preservation technique.
Tim Noakes coined the phrase central governing reflex.
Yeah, I like that.
Brain. So what it does is when the brain is the most important organ in the human body. Except when Nisha got pregnant, another organ was more important. But that's just to wake the audience up a little bit. But the brain is the most important organ in the human body. And a minor fluctuation in energy availability to the brain causes it to shut down other systems that siphon energy away. If you're an athlete or fatigued, you go to rest, you rest your brain. And I think there are two parts. This is not me absolutely not advocating for the consumption of sugar. It's asking for regulation of this massive fluctuation in sugar. And the more insulin sensitive we are, the more we flatline that sugar. The more important thing, though, is to fat adapt so that you always have ketones as a readily available backup for the brain. If the brain has no backup energy source, like a Prius that runs out of electricity, it's got gasoline as a backup. If you look at your kids, at my kids, they live in ketosis. They live in ketosis. Their brain uses some glucose, but they've always got ketones there up front or as a backup. And they've got these two energy systems that allows them not to be hyperactive and then crash. They're just stable. They're busy kids, but they are fundamentally very stable in terms of their daily functions. They think, they cerebrate, and their brain is optimized because of those energy conditions. And I think that can also happen and should happen under conditions of the proper human diet.
Yes, I agree.
So I love your insights into this, and I know I've bounced these ideas, which are they just came at me in the last few days from the people we talked to, and at some stage we'll have some follow-up. I'm sure you'll expound on this. You'll do your own research. You're really good at that, taking a topic that maybe you want to look at other aspects of, researching a little bit, getting people's opinions, and then putting your own podcasts and your own things out there. So folks, look out for Ken Berry's work. Look at his YouTube channel. Look at his Instagram posts. Follow his follow-up to these conversations. I know I'm going to follow up on this, and I may take this conversation and break it up into a few segments if it's okay with you, and
Yep.
some of these, because these are pearls. These are so important when it comes to the knee jerk of whether keto is good or bad. This is the science behind why a low carbohydrate, moderate fat diet is the healthiest way to go, not to correct disease only, but also for life.
Absolutely. And to optimize and live your best life in your best health. Thanks for having me, Doc. I really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure picking your brain.
This is wonderful. And I tell you, I learn so much from you all the time. It's with great humble respect that I have these conversations. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
Take care. Bye-bye.